Hello and welcome to Think Watercolour. Today's demonstration is based on this photo that I took about a year ago on a visit to Newquay in Cornwall, and I thought it makes quite a nice composition fitting with the rule of thirds, but I think the sky is a bit bland, so I'm going to do a more dramatic sky. I've sketched the image on a piece of Saunders Waterford 300-gram rough paper. It's 1/16 of a full sheet, which is roughly 10.5 inches high and 7.5 inches wide. And what I'm going to do to start with, I'm just going to wet some of the sky area with some clean water where I want to retain the white of the paper. And I just want the blue of the sky to just bleed into that a little bit, and the grey shadow of the cloud, which you'll see shortly. I've got a mixture of cobalt blue and cerulean blue for the sky. I've made it quite strong because it will dry lighter. I'm just putting it in around the area that I've wet with clean water and just letting the edges blend so I get a soft edge to the sky and the white clouds. My aim with these clouds is to create a sort of zigzag of leading lines from the top left down to the bottom right where the sky meets the beach, and then using the two people in the far distance as a sort of leading line towards the hull of the boat. Anyway, let's see how that works out. I'm just adding a little bit of burnt sienna to the palette, and I'm going to use some of the sky blue to mix with it to create a grey for the shadows on the clouds. I'm going to keep this fairly light, so I'm going to add some more water in a second just to make it a very weak mixture so that the clouds or the shadows on the clouds aren't too dominant in the picture. My board's flat, so I can work from the bottom of the clouds up without any worry about gravity pulling the pigment back down again. So it works quite well working flat. Sometimes I work at an angle. It depends on whether I want to use gravity to move the pigment around, but in this case I've left it flat because it's a fairly simple sketch. While it's still wet, just adding more and more of the paint. It will dry very, very light, this, but I don't want any dark patches. I don't want the sky to be the dominant feature of the painting, but at the same time I do want that line of the white clouds to lead the eye down towards the beach. This is pure Naples yellow for the beach. It's a fairly weak mix, so it will dry nice and light for me. And I'll be adding a few streaks of raw sienna just to add a little bit of dimensionality to the beach. Just adding that raw sienna now, a few streaks while the Naples yellow is still wet. That will blend in and create some patchy areas in the sand, just to give it some body and depth. I'm going to let the first washes dry now. Now that the initial washes are all dry, I'm adding the sea using the same sky mix with a touch of the Naples yellow added to Give it a slightly green hue. It's just a thin line of sea that you can see at this distance. And again, using the same mix, just doing the hull of the boat, just an initial wash there, just to mark out the blue of the bottom of the hull of the boat. Just adding a little bit of purple to the mix, just to initially paint the shadow under the boat. I'll need to darken this later, but it's just an initial wash to define where the shadow is. Always remember, you can come back when a wash is dry and darken it. Try not to mess about with it while it's still wet, otherwise you could end up with some cauliflowers and runbacks. Just mixing up a little bit of darker patches for the sand, just a few streaks of here and there of basically it's burnt umber with a little bit of blue added, just to darken it slightly, just create some interest in the sand really. I'm just using a very weak green mix, olive green mix, for the hills in the distance on the right. They need to be very light to create that feeling of depth in the painting. Just using the Naples yellow mix just to indicate the shadow side of the hull, where it's actually white, but it's in shadow, so just using that. Doesn't matter what colour you use, as long as the tonal value is right, really. And I'll probably add more to this. Just dropping in some more of the blue there. I think I've messed that up a little bit, so I'm going to just try and lift it out. I'll let that dry and come back to it later. Never worry too much about when you make mistakes, and if they're impossible to correct, then you've learned something. So I've said this before: there are no mistakes, only lessons. The more you practice, the better you'll get at correcting things when you mess things up. For the sail, I'm using the same blue that I used for the sky. Just added a little bit of ultramarine to the mix just to darken it slightly, but basically the same. Now I'm just dropping in some burnt sienna, wet in wet, so that it blends together to create a slightly darker shape, a bit more blue, then it will blend on the page. Using the same colour for the furled sail at the front of the boat. Dropping in a few more patches of the blue just to darken it slightly. I may have to come back and darken that again a bit later, but let's see how it dries. Just using a slightly greyer mix now for this side of the boat where I messed up earlier. And it's just tidying things up a little bit, really. Just trying to get the tonal values right. I may have to darken it again, but I'll wait and see how this dries. The danger is to keep fiddling with it, and I need to make myself not do that. I'd rather show you a demonstration, warts and all. If I make mistakes, I'm happy to demonstrate how to fix them if I do that. Just using a grey for the shadow side of the white cabin. And I'll define the boat a little bit more shortly with some darker colour. Just turning the board on its side, and I'm going to use some neutral tint just to paint the mast. It's much easier to paint masts if you paint horizontally rather than vertically. I sometimes use a ruler as a guide, but in this case it's not really necessary. It's only a quick sketch, so I'd not bother if it's slightly out of shape. Just putting in the cross member there. Just adding a few details of bits and pieces that are on that mast. Keeping it pretty vague. And for the rigging, I'm just leaving the pencil lines because I drew them quite dark, so they would show through any washes. So I don't need to paint over those. It's a useful tip if you're doing rigging and you have got thin lines at this sort of scale. Just use the pencil. Just adding some detail on the hull now just to define it a bit more clearly. Nothing too specific, just an indication of what's there. As I've said before, don't be too slavish about working from photographs. Just a suggestion of what's there should do the trick for the viewer's eye. Just adding a little bit of colour to those distance figures. And a bit of shadow underneath. Maybe a bit too dark. I'll just weaken that a little bit and smudge it with my finger. Shadows at that distance aren't very clear, so it doesn't really matter. But it does help ground the figures to the beach. Just putting some white gouache on the edge of the sea there, and a few details on the hull of the boat and the cabin. I think that's pretty much done now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, do give it a like. It always helps with YouTube. Always remember, watching is learning, but doing is understanding. So the more you practice, the better you'll get, especially when it comes to correcting mistakes. Let the paint dry if you've got to change things, and then have a go at correcting the mistake.